This is an overview of the 1920s and the 1930s. As far as the 1920s go, as a theme, you need to understand that after World War I, America focused once again on isolationist policies. We did not want to get involved in another world war, and so we instead focused on prosperity at home. We had rejected participation in Wilson's international organization called the League of Nations. We did not want to participate in an international organization that might get us involved in another foreign entanglement. And so our pro-business Republican administrations of Harding and Coolidge focused on business development during the Roaring Twenties. Point number 2 of the 1920s is that popular culture reflected the prosperity of the 1920s. Radios broadcasted jazz and other things like sports and news to a national audience. Movies, silent at first and then later with sound, called talkies, developed during the 20s, but would later be an escape from the problems that would be associated with the 1930s Depression era. Newspapers and magazines shaped the culture and sparked fads. The new media also helped to challenge traditional values. This is pretty apparent in the famous Scopes monkey trial, where a teacher in Dayton, Tennessee was arrested for teaching Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And that theory, based on new scientific findings, was challenging biblical teachings of the origin of man. And so that really put a focus in the 1920s of the challenges of traditional values versus new science. Women also challenged traditional roles. Flappers is a term to describe women who cut their hair, wore shorter dresses, like to go out and dance the Charleston. These social trends really reflected new political rights that had been granted to women with their voting rights passed in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Prohibition was the 18th Amendment. It prohibited the sale and distribution of alcohol, but many people in the 1920s broke this prohibition and went to smuggling alcohol or attended speakeasies, which were secret bars where you could get alcohol and break all the rules of prohibition. And then finally, because of our open immigration policies, there was actually a revival of the KKK in the 1920s to oppose the new immigrants entering the country. And then finally, the United States at the end of World War I emerged as a global power, but because of the optimism, there was a excessive amount of speculative growth in the stock market crash. And of course the stock market will crash in 1929, and that will signal the beginning of a decade, 10-year-long Great Depression. And I'm going to go over in this slide as well the causes of the 1930s Great Depression and how the Depression impacted the lives of Americans, as we talked about in class. First of all, just sort of as background, we talked about the business cycle. The 1920s was a period of expansion where there was lots of jobs, lots of money, lots of speculative growth that really superseded and exceeded where supply met demand for a lot of products. In a typical business cycle, once supply had met demand, you'd have a correction in the economy. You might have a short-term business slump with short-term layoffs, decreases in production. But because of the over-speculation of the 1920s, excessive credit, people borrowing money, we entered instead in the 1930s into a long-term business slump, which is called a depression, a Great Depression. We talked about how the stock market is a measure of the health of the business cycle by buying and selling stock, which is ownership in the company. As long as businesses are making money, stockholders are earning money, stockholders may reinvest in the stock market. So a lot of the stock values are based on expectation or speculation. As long as expectation of the market and productivity continues, there's high demand for those business stocks, and the value increases. As soon as the expectation of business growth or the speculative value of businesses starts to decline, so does the value of those stock shares. So when we tied it all together, we essentially said again that the 1920s was a period of over speculation, much of it based on excessive credit that could not be repaid once the stock market crashed, and people realized that the values of their stocks were way overpriced and declined the value of those stocks. And from that point on, it signaled a huge correction in the business cycle that we'd be experiencing, which would be this decade-long Great Depression. In terms of the effects, we talked about, of course, if you were invested in the stock market, you were the first to lose your money. Over the course of the early 1930s, income will drop some 40%, so former businessmen oftentimes depicted having lost their jobs and on the street, having no income anymore. Factories would lay workers off. There's no insurance. There's no social security. Many people had no savings, and at the peak of unemployment, 1 in 4 people, or 25% of people, had no jobs. So there were just not enough jobs for those who were in need during the 1930s. Because people had no savings, there was no insurance to help tide people over. A lot of the down and out needed to rely on the kindness of strangers and lined up for soup kitchens, bread lines, for some kind of substance. There was higher instances of divorce and suicide related to this period, and a growing militancy of labor unions as jobs became more uncertain. We also talked about the fact that banks would fail. This was largely attributed to the Federal Reserves, which is supposed to regulate the monetary supply. The Federal Reserve failed to prevent a widespread collapse of the banking system. People made a run on the bank. There was simply not enough cash on hand to meet the demand, and so banks started to fail, due largely to the severe shortage contraction in the nation's money supply and the circulation of money. Farms and agricultural sector was also largely hit by farm foreclosures. Many farmers in the 1920s had borrowed heavily. They had mortgaged their farm to the bank. They had taken out loans to enlarge their farms during the good times. And then when those loans were called up, of course, they weren't able to pay their bills, and so the banks foreclosed on their homes and their properties. So there's a lot of foreclosure sales that you see related to having lost everything. We said in particular the Great Plains, the Midwest, had a hard time because it was not only the Depression, but the Dust Bowl period as well, where you have severe drought, the wind picks up, and you have these massive dust storms. People lost everything to the bank and to these storms. 25% of people left the Dust Bowl. Many of them, such as the famous migrant mother, were heading west for the hope of jobs in California. This migrant group were called the Okies, many of them from Oklahoma. We gave the example of their lives also being tough in California, as there weren't enough jobs there either. And of course, John Steinbeck would later write a book called The Grapes of Wrath, based on the movement of the Okies and what they found in California. And then finally, the Great Depression was not only here at home, But in the 30s, it was a global depression. Germany, which had been blamed in the Treaty of Versailles and for the war and left with a huge reparations bill to pay, could not repay its debt. And so essentially it worsened the effects of the Great Depression when America could no longer help to loan Germany and loan money to Europe. This is what had happened during the good times. U.S. had been loaning money to Germany. Germany would pay its bills to the Allies, and then we were receiving some of that back as well. But past the 1930s, of course, this cuts off, and so the Great Depression gets worse globally. In the next video, I'll talk more about the administrations of Hoover and FDR, and particularly FDR and the New Deal programs.